It is the single most important decision in what could be the single most important election in the history of the story of our country, one that will affect our children and their children and generations beyond. And with so much on the line, whatever President Joe Biden decides to do with his campaign, to buck up or bow out, what he decides will shape the course of our American future, our American story. And let us underscore one part of what we just said. Whatever Joe Biden decides, that's where this decision lies, according to all the available reporting, with one person, President Joe Biden. Now, given the stakes, it's natural to hunger to know what comes next. But the truth is, no one really knows what comes next. And that appears to include the president himself at this hour. And we, as humans, are not good at this, the unknowing part. Joe Biden has more than earned the right to some space and some grace to do what he's doing right now. To try to reassure his campaign, to make calls to allies, to talk to his family, to sit with the data. We were told by officials that the data will shape and drive his next moves. The New York Times reported today, citing a single anonymous source, that the president told a key ally that he knows he may not be able to salvage his candidacy if he cannot convince the public in the coming days that he's up for the job after a disastrous debate performance last week. We should tell you, NBC News has not confirmed that conversation. The White House this afternoon vehemently denying it took place. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre calling the New York Times reporting absolutely false. But where even a week ago we might have dismissed such a report out of hand, now it just adds to this feeling of uncertainty in this moment. For his part, the president, who now suggests that his debate performance was the result of global travel, is going about his normal presidential duties. This hour, he's expected to award posthumous medals of honor to a pair of Civil War heroes. We'll show that to you when it happens. Later this evening, he will meet with Democratic governors virtually and in person on this very topic, the state of his campaign. His staff is also trying to reassure others and themselves, apparently, that Biden 2024 is still all systems go. This afternoon, the campaign held an all-staff call with the president and vice president on that call. The topic was staying the course. That message, though, might best be directed at President Joe Biden's big donors today. Many of them have been waiting for reliable, accurate polling data before plotting their next choices, their path forward. Today, they got some of that. New data from the New York Times indicates that among likely voters, Donald Trump, who was already ahead, expanded his lead over Joe Biden by 6 points following the debate. Among registered voters, that margin balloons to 9 points. The figures on your screen are rounded outside of the slightly smaller margin of error. Notably, Donald Trump, a wannabe dictator who isn't hiding it, with a reflexive habit of posting everything and anything at all hours of the day, true or false, has been practically silent about the future and fate of Joe Biden's candidacy on social media. Whatever the reason for that, the threat he poses looms large and is not lost on President Biden's circle. As elected Democrats try to figure out what comes next, listen to how Congressman Jamie Raskin, one of the Democratic Party's most influential voices, describes this moment to our colleague Chris Hayes.
There will be lots of discussion and lots of people weighing in. And I know this is a moving target. It's got to happen quickly. But I can guarantee you, Chris Hayes, there will be massive unity and focus on that task when we get to the end of this process.
Every passing minute brings us closer to the Democratic National Convention and then to Election Day after that. So it's worth repeating. This is a profoundly consequential and sober moment in American political history. And to borrow a favorite phrase from President Joe Biden, quote, "That's not hyperbole." It's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. The host of Politics Nation here on MSNBC, the president of the National Action Network, the Reverend Al Sharpton, is here. Plus, senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe, MSNBC political analyst Kim Atkins-Storr is here. MSNBC columnist and contributor Charlie Sykes is here, and political strategist, MSNBC senior analyst Matt Dowd is here. I would like to ask all of you, first I want to thank all of you for being here. This is a story that it feels like it antagonizes a lot of our audience. It's a very hard story to tell. I have mountains of admiration for the president and his family and what they've sacrificed in the spirit of public service. I also have a duty to cover this story wherever it goes. And I appreciate all of you being here. You don't have to be here, and I appreciate all of you being here. I want to share the reporting and then ask all of you to sort of help us make sense of it for our audience. President Obama, Rev, is reported to be looking at what I understand the White House is looking at, the data. And this is what the Washington Post reports. Quote, former President Barack Obama has privately told allies who have reached out to him that President Biden's already tough path to re-election grew more challenging after his shaky debate performance on Thursday. A harsher assessment of the presidential race in his public comments, according to several people familiar with his remarks. The White House was reported to have been waiting for this New York Times poll, which is why we led with it as well. And it is another blow, if you will, for the state of the presidential race?
Well, I think that aside from the polling, which could go up and down given whatever happens in the next few days, but I think that I certainly agree with those that say Joe Biden deserves the right and space to make his decision. Look at what he's been able to do as president. And I think he should not be rushed into a decision one way or another. Secondly, I think that we're on the eve of the 4th of July. When we saw what the Supreme Court just did in terms of the powers of a presidency, I don't know how we celebrate the 4th tomorrow without really making a campaign issue. Can we even risk having someone who has openly said he wanted to be a dictator on day one, openly said he wants retribution, to sit in that chair while we have a constitutional crisis with this right-wing Supreme Court? So I think more than the New York Times poll, the Supreme Court decision changed everything for a lot of people. We cannot risk that. Whatever the president decides, and I certainly think it's an awful standard to have, say, now one bad debate, now you're out of the race. I don't know whether we can sustain that throughout the rest of presidential history, that now if you just blow it one time, you're out of the race, unless there are other underlying circumstances. But I think the Supreme Court decision has to be front and center, and I think media needs to talk more about that than to talk about some debate and the polling, because America changed yesterday, and we're getting ready to have barbecue when the Supreme Court has just barbecued our rights.
Does that, I appreciate your point. I agree with your point. We spend a lot more time on the Supreme Court than we have on the state of any race, the presidential or otherwise, Rev. So I associate myself with your opinions on this. But I want to ask you what conversations you're having.
I'm having conversations with a lot of people, some are off the record, and most of them have said that they think that President Biden will carry on and he will go forward. I've also had some that said they're hoping that he will go forward. I've not had any civil rights leaders or people that I've talked to in government that said he should step aside. But even more telling, I do a syndicated radio show every day, and I've maybe had one caller out of 50 or more that I handle over 2 days or 3 days, maybe 20 callers a day. Only one has said he ought to step aside. I think that the public really became incensed at a lot of what Donald Trump had to say. This whole thing of black jobs and the lies he told. I think, and many of them watch your show and talk about how you fairly parsed that out, because people are ignoring the offensive stuff that was said. I was disturbed when Joe Biden couldn't finish one or two sentences. I was more disturbed with the sentences Donald Trump did finish.
Yeah, it's a great way. It's a great way to underscore what is actually in front of the voters. Matt Dowd, it was your job to read polls, and I have to say, to the Rev's point, if a debate performance shaped presidential political history, George Bush never would have been elected. He bombed his first debate. I think at least 2 of 3 of the debates against John Kerry, so that is also true. But I don't want to ignore what voters are saying. I care a lot less about what the press is saying, what the polls are saying. But it is also true, and it is a painful truth, that there are a lot of people concerned, not just about a debate performance, but about Joe Biden's age. What is your counsel for this campaign in this White House?
Well, I'm really glad we're having this conversation, and I'm really glad you started it off about saying that we need to give Joe Biden grace and space. I think we all deserve grace and space at any moment in our life, and so especially the President of the United States. I mean, I think what this has done is it's elicited an incredible emotional response in this moment because the stakes are so high. And in many people's minds, especially the people that are watching the show, our democracy is at stake. And as the Reverend said, the Supreme Court decision even underlined that even more, because basically it's the Supreme Court said that Donald Trump wants to be a dictator, and we're going to let him be a dictator. That's basically what the Supreme Court allowed and said and gave permission for in the course of this, which is incredibly scary, and it's understandably emotionally in the course of this. To me, there's two separate issues to look at. The one, the grace and space for the president. And I, for one, am not one that calls for that he needs to step down, or I don't think others should that don't have influence over the process or over his decision. It's going to be his decision and his decision alone. And there's very few people that will have influence over him, to him, in that process in the course of this. One, whatever we say is not going to alter the course of what Biden does in the course of this. And so, in fact, I think many of us and pundits, if we get out there and say he should step back, it's actually going to have the reverse effect of what people want, because I think people are going to dig in the course of this.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.